welcome to our 8th debate of term here at the Cambridge Union. Thank you all for making it out here on quite a cold and wet and windy start to the busy last week of term, so thank you all for being here. The motion for the House this evening is this House regrets the NHS's status as a national religion. This will follow the same format as all of our debates. We've got 6 speakers, each about 10 minutes to speak. After the second and fourth speakers, there will be the opportunity for you from the floor to make a short speech of up to a minute in length. And as ever, we do have a prize for the best floor speech, and this year it is a meal for 2 at Novi. During any of the speakers' speeches, you may stand up and say, challenge something they say on that point or point of information. It is up to them whether or not they accept and let you make that point, so please do respect their wishes. Besides that, we're pretty much good to go. So our first speaker this evening on the proposition is Baroness Jolly, who is the Liberal Democrat Spokesperson for Health. Judith, the floor is yours.
Do I have my back to people? Do I have my back to the people behind me? Go for it, okay. Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to do this. It's a first for me, and I was thinking coming up on the train, it's a bit like the day that I did my maiden speech in the House of Lords, because everybody's been there forever, and literally some people have really been there forever, and it's just a case of getting on with it. So this House regrets that the NHS's status as a national religion. I think that this motion does a complete disservice to both religion and also to the NHS. But I think it's going to prove an interesting debate. You could argue that there is faith evident in both. It's easy to look at the faith in religion. Faith is central to all beliefs, whether it's a belief in God, whether it's Yahweh, Allah, praise be upon him, Buddha, plenty of Hindu gods, and all sorts of strange other unusual religions that cover the world. And faith, I think, is really very evident in the NHS. Surveys have told us that people have remarkable faith in the NHS. It has a hugely high level of trust, despite the fact that with not absolutely monotonous frequently, but fairly often, there are very, very high-profile NHS mistakes, NHS scandals, but still people have a faith in the NHS, in their GP, in their local hospital. And I think we need to be really, really careful that we can't paint religion and NHS with the same brush. So faith is evident in both, despite lapses in behaviour or performance in both. And I think recent times have seen lapses in behaviour of religious leaders as well as lapses in behaviour of clinicians. Which brings us nicely from faith, takes us onto the world of miracles. Now, the NHS doesn't rely on faith to do its work. It relies on evidence, it relies on science. It also relies on huge and enormous research budgets to come up with effective and efficient ways of looking after us, to keep us well or to make us better. Patients vest faith in clinicians and also in their establishments. You will hear somebody who has been to see a doctor regularly saying, oh gosh, I really, really rate Dr. Bloggs. They're the person to go to. Wouldn't go and see anyone else. Dr. Smith, I wouldn't touch her with a barge pole. So Dr. X is wonderful. You can always rely on her. Our local hospital is brilliant. They helped my granny. They helped my husband's sister. They were great with the kids when they kept breaking their feet, doing whatever. It never lets you down. We couldn't do without it. But clinicians put their faith in evidence, in experience, and in science. And for all that miracles do happen, and many doctors will tell you that somebody was really on their way out, and you would have to uncomfortable conversation with them to say, you know, I don't expect your loved one to last the day, the night, or whatever, and something amazing happens, and they recover. So it isn't unusual for there to be something that is described as a miracle within the NHS. Somebody in a coma on life support for months against all the odds and the expectations and against the logic, they wake up. And the NHS and religion both share faith. They share values. There's a sociologist called Robert Morrison McIver, and he said that religion implies a relationship between man and some higher power. Now, the NHS is underpinned with relationships. The NHS wouldn't work without clinicians having the ability, for the most part, to forge relationships, and sometimes pretty quickly. But the relationships are also between individuals like clinicians, like care workers, like porters, like cleaners, cooks, the person who comes around with the tea, the paramedics. And there's a well-oiled wheel. If you've ever been into hospital and you have to go from A&E to have an X-ray, you'll be wheeled along by a porter, and they will have a banter that just keeps you going, to keep your spirits up. So relationships are really important. So the values that exist within many, many faiths can actually be found within the NHS. But there is no higher power, despite the fact that the chief exec or the chief nurse might have you say so. The values underpin religion and NHS. And I want to talk about somebody that I expect Chris Ham, who's going to wind up for us this evening, will know really well. I'm going to talk about a man called Steve Field. Now, Steve Field retired this week after a life working within the NHS. He was a GP, he was an academic, he then became Chief Inspector for the CQC for primary care and GPs. And I was invited to a party to say farewell to Steve and wish him on his way. But before we got to drinks, we all had to sit, just like you are, in a row, and listen to four people talk about how they had worked with Steve or how they had come across him and what it meant to them, which is most unusual for a party where you expect you're just going to be drinking wine and cheese on sticks. And all of them, and I don't think they'd actually agreed this between themselves, all of them said the things that made them value his role was that compassion and care were his watchwords. So when he went out as Chief Inspector for CQC into primary care settings, he would look for compassion and care and expect to see it. Compassion and care was their conclusion of his life's work. And I think for a clinician to have that said of you at the end of their time is really quite something. And I guess if you were a bishop as well, or any other holy person, a chief rabbi, you'd expect somebody would say something very similar about you. And so it's values. Do good to your fellow man, a bishop or a holy person might say. But religion is a way of life. It requires submission in the way that the NHS, I suppose some people might say it was the way of life. You might think you were on a treadmill, but I'm not sure that submission in quite the same way is what you'd get. But the NHS, it gives life, it preserves life, and it saves life. It witnesses our deaths. Let's go back to the 1940s. William Beveridge, a Liberal, was a member of Churchill's cabinet. And he wrote a paper in 1942 about 5 evils: the evil of want, ignorance, squalor, idleness, and disease. And this paper became the basis of the NHS and the welfare state, now DWP. And you might think that he was a religious man, but he wasn't. He was an adherent of someone called Auguste Comte, and he was a materialist agnostic. And before we get a rosy glow about Beveridge, he also looked towards eugenics to solve problems, but that is very often conveniently forgotten. If you went to the sort of school that started with hymns, you might have sung a hymn, God is working his purpose out. The NHS was 70 a couple of years ago, and I've been involved in the NHS for 20 years. And in that time, there have been many plans. But the latest one was called the long-term plan. So that just wasn't for the next few years. It was to go forever, the great plan. But the sad thing about the great plan is that you could argue that there was neither sufficient workforce nor sufficient money to deliver it properly. And who is the god of the NHS plan? Not the Secretary of State, they come and go, nor the Chief Exec of NHS England, so do they, although this one's lasted a while. The NHS is a complex institution, understood by a few, used by all. The NHS, faith expressed by comfortable practices and modern treatments, both play a role in British tradition, culture and faith. In the NHS, there is no worship, no creed, assembly or tithing. Ladies and gentlemen, I support the notion the NHS is no religion, but central to many lives, an old familiar friend, freely available and taken for granted. But I suspect it will outlast me.
Thank you, Baroness Jolly. And now moving over to the opposition, our first speaker this evening is Dominic Bealby, who is a first-year law student at Corpus Christi College and who won this slot through an open audition. Dominic, the floor is yours.
Thank you, everyone. I apologise if I'm slightly nervous. This is, of course, my first debate, but I hope everything will go rather smoothly. In the spirit of the motion put to this House, I will focus on the moral argument for the NHS and that we should continue to hold it in the highest esteem possible. For those unaware, the motion is derived from a quote by the former Conservative Chancellor of the Exchequer, Nigel Lawson, who claimed that the NHS is the closest thing that the English have to a national religion. Now, this will probably be the first and last time that I openly agree with a Conservative Chancellor of the Exchequer, but I must say he was absolutely spot on. The NHS should be proudly held as a national religion, by which we surely mean a core part of our national character, the institution that exemplifies our moral and social values. Therefore, the House should reject the motion before it tonight. The reason why the NHS is and should be held as a national religion is that it exemplifies everything that is good about British society: communalism, solidarity, and above all, compassion for our fellow citizens. The key tenet of the NHS is simple. I quote from the founder of the NHS, Anionwu Bevan, who brought the NHS into life in the ruins of post-war Britain. Illness is neither an indulgence for which people have to pay, nor an offence for which they should be penalised, but a misfortune, the cost of which should be shared by the community. I hope you all sense the power of that idea now. I certainly do. Healthcare, free at the point of use for all citizens, without qualification. Healthcare that will relieve your money worries in times of illness. That principle at the core of our NHS is one of the greatest and most profound social developments in our country's history. When we moved as a society from the barbarous and cold-hearted times where we let people without the means die, to one in which all people were guaranteed a right to healthcare as a citizen. I do realise that all of this is rather abstract, so please let me give an example of the principle in action. When I was 2, I had retinal cancer. I was the second child of the family to be diagnosed with cancer at that same age, and I'm afraid to say that my older brother did not survive. But within 2 weeks of my diagnosis, I'd been transferred from a hospital in Scarborough, the first patient there to use their new MRI scanner, to receive specialist treatment down in London from an extraordinary group of people. I receive aftercare for this even today. I have an artificial eye, and it is a reminder of how lucky I am to be here, but also of what the NHS did for me. I want you to imagine now that situation and how it must have been for my parents, my mother having already lost a child to cancer, the pain, the anguish, the utter dread that must have plagued every single moment until my remission was confirmed. Quite simply, it must have been a living hell. But imagine now that very same situation, those very same feelings, but now there's something else which draws their attention. It's the hospital demanding to see insurance forms before they operate. It is the doctor's first question being not "how is your son?" but "what is your credit card number?" It is a repugnant thought. Not once was money a barrier to my own treatment. Never once was healthcare predicated on cash. The only concern for anyone was my well-being. I was a human, not a source of income for a shareholder. The NHS treats people like people, not profit makers. It is the sign of a socially advanced society that human dignity is at the heart of its healthcare system, and indeed its national values, if we accept that the NHS is a national religion. If upholding the NHS as a national religion means we accept a compassionate and dignified principle of healthcare delivery, then I do not regret it. Rather, I am a happy disciple. However, it is not just the present that we must consider before we in this House restate our support for the NHS by rejecting this motion. We must consider the past. Pre-NHS healthcare was very simply a highwayman's choice, your money or your life. For the wealthy, of course, this wasn't a problem. But for the working class, this choice was rather more simple. Naturally, there were charitable scraps from the tables of the rich that allowed for some miserable souls to have healthcare, the warm words of charity, cloaking the economically inefficient and morally bankrupt resource allocation of the dwindling days of the British aristocracy. For some, there was even the option of living out their final days in a workhouse. Human beings with illnesses reduced to the social status of the feckless, lazy, and corrupt, according to an individualist philosophy from the Victorian era that continues, rather unfortunately, to pervade through a certain kind of our politics today. Again, I am talking very much in the abstract, so I turn to an account of a man whose life was our history, Harry Leslie Smith. I hope you have heard of him. His life was not the quaint Britain of old from Downton Abbey, but it was an uncivilized and barbarous time in which access to health corresponded with wealth. He describes living in the slums of pre-war Barnsley, hearing the wail of a woman on a street who was dying of cancer, who could not afford morphine to ease her passage from this life. Harry's own sister, Marion, contracted tuberculosis when she was a child, and as they could not pay for doctors, she had to be restrained with ropes to her bed to stop her writhing around from the pain, before she was dispatched to a workhouse, where she died and was dumped, nameless, in a pauper's grave. So let us never forget why we have our NHS. It was not born out of a stale bureaucracy trying to allocate resources in some sterile exercise, but it was created to serve the people. It was created by the people that remembered the time when public health bowed out to private wealth. We do a disservice to their memory when we call into question the principle for which they fought. If upholding the NHS as a national religion means that we remember the horrors of the past and vow never to return to those dark days, then I do not regret it. Rather, I say, let us worship at the altar. Now, I am well aware of what the anti-NHS body would say. I'm sure that they would wish to accuse me of rhetoric or lazy intellectualism, but I am not the free thinkers that they are, wishing to depart from the well-established orthodoxy of the greatest social institution in the country, and indeed possibly the world. So I'd like to briefly deal with some themes. The NHS makes economic sense. It is cheaper than the US healthcare system, one which does not ensure universal access, and we all know how well America is dealing with healthcare at the moment. Aren't they happy with it? We spend 9.7% of GDP on healthcare, the US 19.2%. Per head, spending in the UK is around £2,900, in the US £7,600. It is simple stuff to say that the NHS is good value for money. And on an understanding of the economics of scale, it is obvious that the pooling of resources to provide a public service is the most efficient method of service delivery. Where there is a natural monopoly of a service, the correct way in which it should be provided is centrally. It is a fact that we recognise in law enforcement, in national defence, and at least until very recently, education. I can't think that anyone would call it wrong to regard the principle of the central management of the armed forces to be incorrect. Of course, it is right to ask how the armed forces should provide their service, but we really do them a disservice when we ask whether the armed forces should provide the service they do. Similarly, we should ask how the NHS should deliver care, but not whether the NHS should deliver care. The principle is one which should stand. The way in which, of course, it is exercised is up for debate, but that does not mean that we should regret its status as a social, central pillar of our society. But that attitude strangles the debate around healthcare, so they might say. Well, first of all, I would say I hope you're enjoying the debate tonight. Secondly, and I'll be honest, I don't care much for what is often put forward as a wishy-washy talk of freedom of choice, which is always put forward as if it adds some sort of innate miraculous strength to what is a threatening position to our National Health Service. Those who regret the status of the NHS, I'm sorry to say, don't believe in freedom. The freedom which the NHS endows is true freedom, the liberty to live your life knowing that you'll be cared for no matter your social position, nor the size of your bank account. The freedom that they may propose is the right to be treated by a healthcare provider as a resource to be exploited for profit. The freedom for the rich to pay lower taxes to afford a new Ferrari, whilst a citizen in an A&E is denied care. The freedom to weaken and even potentially destroy the greatest social institution in the world. Because we all know what those who wish to weaken the status of the NHS want. We know what this debate is really about. To doubt the principle that the NHS is built on means that there must be some sort of replacement. And what could it be? Private healthcare. A privatized NHS devoid of the soul which makes it great and which protects human dignity. I say that we should not allow for that to happen. The NHS, to conclude, is a system which in principle protects the dignity of people. It prevents the ghosts of the past returning to haunt the weak and the poor. It is a system that makes economic sense and is cheaper than failing healthcare in the US. Obviously, we cannot say that the way in which care is delivered cannot be talked about, because indeed we must talk about the burdens of the future. But we must never derogate from the principle. We must keep the NHS alive. And I say that because I fear for what would happen to somebody like me if the NHS is not there for them in the future. If upholding the NHS as a national religion means we resolve never to return to the past and preserve the NHS for the future, then I do not regret it. Rather, I say that if you agree with this, our sermon here today, then vote against the motion tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Dominic, for that speech, and we'll now move to a round of floor speeches. So this is your chance as the audience to make short speeches of a minute in length. And if you have a point to make, please do state your name and college for the record first. So does anybody have a point in proposition of the motion this evening? We'll go down in the grey hoodie first, I think there.
Peter McLaughlin, down in college. So the first speaker for the opposition very eloquently made the argument for a universalized healthcare system that anyone can access. And I think that that is genuinely a really powerful ideal that we should all stand in favor of. Everyone should be in favor of the idea that every single human being has a right to healthcare and a right to be treated regardless of their ability to pay. But the question is not whether they should have a right to be treated regardless of ability to pay, but rather whether they should be treated by the NHS. A comparison was made between the British system, the NHS, and the American system. And the US healthcare system is barbarous and unfair. I cannot deny that. But the US is not the only other developed nation in the world. Most other developed nations have universal healthcare, but many of them do not have centralized systems like the US, and most of them rank higher than the UK for healthcare provision. Most of them are more efficient, many of them are cheaper, and a large number of them are better at providing healthcare and lose fewer lives each year to preventable illnesses. If we are genuinely in favor of universal healthcare, we should be able to have a debate about the best way to provide it. And the best way to provide it must be regardless of ability to pay, but that need not be through a system like the NHS. Thank you.
Thank you. And does anybody have a point in opposition of the motion? Down here?
Thank you. Owen McArdle, St Catherine's College. This is turned out actually quite nicely to be a point more or less in response to the floor speech we've just heard. Now, last year I studied in Germany. I don't talk about that at all, ever. And Germany has a system very much like the one we've just described. But in Germany, the university freshers' fair is a freshers' fair of health insurers, in part, at least. If you walk through the town, you see office upon office of insurance firms. And basically, the upshot of that is the system is very bureaucratic. If you go into hospital, yes, you will be treated. You will not be chucked out on the street, and you'll be treated regardless of means. But the bill will drop through the letterbox one day, and you'll have to sort it out. Now, the great thing about the NHS is you don't do that. Yes, the NHS is bureaucratic. Yes, the NHS does not have enough local control. But at least the bureaucracy is being done by someone in an office and not the patient themselves.
Thank you. And finally, does somebody have a point in abstention of the motion they would like to make? No? Is it? Oh, one over there. Yep.
Hi, I'd just like to say firstly to the opposition speaker, I really admire the fact that you came here, and power to you for being able to make it through your cancer. Like, please don't take what I'm saying as a personal argument against you. It's just something that I generally do have a concern about. So obviously our last general election was a couple of years ago, and I think for me, none of the main parties were really able to grapple with the difficult questions surrounding the NHS's existence today, and I'd like to see that perhaps kind of entertained on both sides of the debate. One of the main problems for me anyway with the NHS is its kind of treatment of old people and what we're supposed to do once people become very elderly. We're obviously kind of in a country that has a sort of stagnating birth rate, but an increasing kind of like an aging population. And I don't think either party really sufficiently said about how they would reorientate the NHS to kind of deal with that arising challenge to our generation. And I'd like to, I want the NHS to be a sustainable social institution. I think it should be. But I don't see that currently being the case now. And I worry that if we make it too much religion and invest too much faith in it, we kind of shelter ourselves from asking these really important questions that otherwise need to be asked. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We'll now return then to the main debate, and our second speaker on the proposition is Zachary Marsh, who is a first-year historian at Robinson College. Zachary, the floor is yours.
The first scene, of Aaron Sorkin's The Newsroom sees the protagonist, played by Jeff Daniels, go on a startlingly eloquent rant about why America is not the greatest country in the world. He argues America leads the world in only 3 categories: incarceration rates, belief in angels, and defense spending. But how does this relate to the NHS? Because in the OECD's 2017 report, the National Health Service did not lead in any category. Not one. The National Health Service is not the greatest health service in the world. And in almost any other country, in almost any other political culture around healthcare, we could have a mature discussion about why that's the case. But too many people in the UK today have a fundamental problem with that conversation. That is because, no thank you, in the words of the motion and of Nigel Lawson, the NHS is the closest thing this country has to a religion. Tonight I'm going to make 2 arguments. I'm first of all going to argue why the NHS doesn't deserve that status. But I'm mainly going to consider why the idea of the NHS as a sacred cow is bad for public discourse and bad for public healthcare in itself. So I think we can all agree that for the NHS to be justified as a national religion, there would need to be a convincing case for it being put on that pedestal. An obvious argument for our devotion then would be if the NHS really was an exceptional healthcare system. Yet, as I've already explained, according to various respected comparisons, including the OECD, the NHS is a pretty average system as far as other highly developed countries go. The healthcare consumer powerhouse doesn't even rank us in the global top 10 behind our neighbours, France and Norway. The Lancet ranked us below Slovenia. Many will say that that's about funding, and it's certainly true that the NHS works on less than some systems. But the extent to which that is the case has been vastly overstated. The Netherlands, routinely ranked one of the best healthcare systems in the world, spends only about 0.5% more of its GDP on healthcare, according to the IFS. Ultimately, our national religion has us worshipping an institution with very mixed performance. Others argue that it's about the principles of our healthcare system, universal and free at the point of use. This is the NHS's core foundation myth that the reforms of the Attlee government represented a fundamental upheaval from a private sector model that deprived the sick and the vulnerable of care. But again, we are far from unique in this regard. Almost every European health system provides full care regardless of one's ability to pay. It genuinely baffles me that this country seems to have such an informational blind spot on this issue, that if you don't support the NHS, you must somehow be an advocate of the failed American system. In reality, there are many universal alternatives to the NHS that outperform our own, and so arguing that our healthcare system is an isolated beacon of equality and social responsibility is simply disingenuous. However, I'd now like to turn to what I consider to be the most compelling case for the proposition, which is that the national religion status of the NHS is actually to the detriment of our health system and to us as patients. The overarching reason for this is our innate desire to shield the NHS against legitimate criticism. We too often leap to its defense and drown out valid critiques because for some indiscernible reason, we feel uncomfortable when seeing the NHS challenged. So instead, we prefer to look away and stamp out negative analysis, preserving a cultural consensus that the NHS is the best thing since sliced bread. One of the ways this has been most clearly damaging is that it has prohibited us from having a really pressing national conversation about the NHS in the context of the UK's changing demography. When the NHS was created just over 50 years ago, it was a genius system, but largely because it was precisely tailored to the society of the time. Today, all its assumptions about demography have been turned on their heads. Our tax base, in comparison to our total population, is small. Life expectancy has increased by over 10 years, and some people can expect to live up to 30 years in retirement, all whilst their healthcare costs spiral. Our current funding model is unsustainable, but to admit that is to open oneself to castigation. It would be a betrayal of the values of the NHS, tantamount to privatisation. In reality, the NHS cannot survive if we do not enact something like the Conservative social care policy of 2017, where we ask those with means to contribute a little to their own care, while stepping up and protecting those who cannot afford to do so. The alternative is an unacceptable tax burden on our generation and a dying institution. Yet our blind love for the NHS means we refuse to acknowledge how essential major reform is to its survival. And when we think of we are defending our NHS, we are often really tying the hands of our representatives and starving other crucial public services of funding. You see, we are preconditioned in this country to use our political voice to protect our health services resources. So when we are told that our health system is in crisis, we make it clear that we expect our MPs and our government to respond in the streets, through the polls and at the ballot box. This sends a clear message to our politicians. Thou shalt not prioritise anything over the NHS. So when our first post-austerity dividend came in, Theresa May spent the full 20 billion on our health service, while simultaneously telling other departments that nothing would be coming their way. Nothing for our outdated infrastructure or our overcrowded schools. We can claim that these are government priorities, but surely we as voters deserve some responsibility. Rational politicians will provide more of what the public wants. Until we resist hysterical tabloid news stories about the NHS being in perpetual crisis and make clear that we have wider social priorities, our representatives will respond to a foaming mouth stereotype and send money in only one direction. Yet the worst effect of this culture of NHS worship, and the one which has had the most devastating impact on families nationwide, is the way it has allowed the health establishment to dismiss scandal. I'm sure many of you will have heard of the infamous mid-staffs crisis, where between 400 and 1,200 patients died of poor care at Staffordshire Hospital between 2005 and 2009. Patients lay in soiled beds with food trays left out of their reach. The various inquiries showed a sector slow to self-regulate and eager to look after its own, where potential whistleblowers were bullied into silence by their colleagues and their managers. It is widely considered the worst health scandal in the UK in modern times. No, thank you. Yet not one person has ever been prosecuted. Nurses who drop patients on floors have since been promoted. Julie Bailey, whose mother died at mid-staffs, fought a 5-year campaign for the truth. She's now been run out of town, insulted on the streets where she grew up, her mother's grave vandalized. No, I'm not for a moment suggesting that the opposition condone this treatment, but they are nonetheless defending a culture which at its extremes produces this behavior. There's something toxic about a narrative which views such events as inconvenient stains on what ought to be a spotless embodiment of socialized healthcare. There's something downright terrifying about a social institution too powerful to expose and too big to fail, where governments down to citizens would rather look away than evaluate the consequences. This is what happened to 5-year-old Ellie Mae Clark, who died after a GP turned her away for an appointment for being 5 minutes late. In both cases, the healthcare establishment rushed to paint these as isolated incidents. That narrative has stopped us looking at how these horrific events might actually indicate systemic issues. If we refuse to be objective, to acknowledge serious failures for what they are, we risk more tragedy. Our blind love for the NHS has seen us lose perspective. No institution should be protected when their actions lead to loss of life. We can respect the NHS, and of course we must appreciate that death is an inevitable part of healthcare. But when people's lives become collateral damage for a monolithic system whose existence we prioritise over patients, something has gone badly wrong. The core weakness of the narrative that we have created around the NHS is that we as patients have become supplicants. We continue to feel an outdated sense of gratitude, which no longer reflects the expectations we ought to have of care in one of the richest countries in the world. We still view the NHS as doing us a favour. It's a maddening and saddening position to be in. It's my view, perhaps controversially, that for our NHS to improve, patients will need to view themselves as consumers. We need to stop viewing care as free and realise we've been paying for it through a lifetime of taxation. We need to start expecting a certain quality of care and not making excuses for an institution, which, whilst often amazing, is sometimes indefensible. In short, we finally need to develop a sense of entitlement. The NHS should shape to our care needs and not the other way around. Overall, then, it's clear that the NHS is far from unique or exceptional. Many countries of similar development to us use different systems to provide the same kind of universally accessible care, whilst also delivering better outcomes for their citizens. The British psyche contains the mistaken impression that our health system is the envy of the world, the model millions globally look to and emulate. In reality, while the NHS gets many things right, we should be able to exercise the self-awareness to consider why so many nations have chosen radically different systems and why their care outcomes are so often superior to our own. The religious fervour of our devotion to the NHS helps no one. It stops us planning for the future, rationally contextualising our health services within all the other priorities of our modern state, and most importantly, from facing up to the failures of the system. People shouldn't have to die before we can criticise the NHS's weaknesses. We must be willing to view the NHS as fallible and capable of unacceptable failures, not necessarily because of random tragedy, but systemic weaknesses. At the end of his speech in the newsroom about the flaws of America, Jeff Daniels says that the first step to solving a problem is to recognise that you have one. The NHS is not the greatest health system in the world. Perhaps if more of us take the small step of realising that tonight, we will be one step closer to a world where it can be. Thank you.
Thank you, Zachary, for that speech. And we now cross over to the opposition and Dame Elizabeth Anionwu, who was a founder of the Mary Seacole Centre for Nursing Practice. Dame Elizabeth, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, my opposition to this proposal is informed by personal and professional experiences. First of all, I'm part of that elder group, the burden. I was actually born virtually a year before the launch of the National Health Services. As the Americans say, do your math, and you'll work out how old I am. So I feel as though I know that I've actually grown up with the National Health Service. But first of all, just to give you a little bit about my background. I like to think that I was conceived somewhere between Newnham College and Trinity Hall. Why was that? Well, because I'm the outcome of an affair of Cambridge University students just after the Second World War. My mother was white, Irish Catholic heritage, and the Newnham College classics student. My father was Nigerian. He came over from Nigeria on a scholarship and was the Trinity Hall law student. They separated, they never married. And actually, I didn't literally find my father until I was 25. Life was difficult for my mother because she refused to come back to college, even though she had the offer to complete her studies. you can understand the difficulties, and I think it's quite useful to remember the social context, the historical context that is so relevant for the beginnings of the National Health Service, but for those of us in my situation growing up at that time. But whilst it was difficult, she refused to ever consider adoption for me. However, though, my first 9 years were spent in care in a children's home run by Catholic nuns in Birmingham. And there I had an overdose of religion. So much so that I eventually lost my faith. Maybe that's why I like the REM song, Losing My Religion, which I do love. But on the positive side, it was actually where I decided that I wanted to become a nurse. Because there was this incredibly kind, humorous, sensitive, expert caring of my painful eczema and my asthma by a nursing nun. In that era, my mother was not allowed to visit me at one point when I was around 7 months because there was an outbreak of diphtheria. I didn't get it. And then, when I was about 19 months, she was encouraged to come and visit me as often as she could because I was severely ill with whooping cough. And I just throw these out because you might then understand why I am so keen on the preventive aspects of health, such as immunization and vaccination. Now, I read in the Irish News a letter the other day which said, as part of it, believing without evidence is normally considered a sign of madness or stupidity, and our judicial system would fall apart if it accepted such recourse. Yet religion is one area of our lives where the lack of evidence is still highly regarded. Now, it could be that this forms the basis of the proposition in terms of, as the second speaker has highlighted, possibly zealous and, anyway, we listen to his arguments. Definition of religion: cause, principle, or system of beliefs held to with ardor and faith. And already one of our speakers has focused on faith, which is what I'm going to do. I'm not religious, but I respect religion, other people's religions and what they can do for people. But I'm a person that has faith in systems, certain systems anyway. And the NHS is one. Now, in 1965, I commenced my nursing course in London. When I was doing some research about Cambridge Union debates, the one that struck me most actually happened in 1965. It was when the two Americans, James Baldwin and William F. Buckley Jr. Now, there's no way I am going to be on any level with James Baldwin, but what a debate. By 1971, I qualified as a health visitor, and this is when I made my first visit to the United States of America. It was a study tour, a group of people we wanted to compare and contrast healthcare provision between our two countries. One of those individuals was a journalist, she's still my friend, and she's actually an MP now. And when I wrote my memoirs a couple of years ago, she was one of the people I interviewed. And she recalled this incident. I remember on our first stop in New York, we were sitting on high stools in the breakfast room, and this porter just fell over. You thought he might have had a heart attack, and as a result, you immediately went over to him. I remember the scene very well, she said, and you tried to loosen his tie. And they said, "Stop, don't touch him." How surprised we both were. You've got to first check his medical insurance status. And they decided which ambulance to call. That was my introduction to the United States Health Service. And I can understand possibly why I have followed the situation over there in respect to health. And nothing's caused me to ever change my mind about the fact that I feel that I am lucky to live in a country that has the NHS. And that is not meaning that I disregard other types of healthcare service. But this is my country, this is my home, and I'm actually quite happy with the NHS. I have criticisms of the NHS, of course. My career in the NHS involved working within the primary healthcare team as a health visitor, focusing, as I alluded to earlier, prevention of illness, but also as well in the more acute settings. I became the first UK sickle cell nurse specialist. This is a serious, sickle, you probably all know, is a serious and sometimes fatal inherited red blood disorder, mainly affecting black and minority populations. Now, looking back over the years, I'm constantly struck by the number of individuals who have personal knowledge, either through their family, their friends, or themselves, of severe, unexpected, and dramatic need for urgent attention within the healthcare system. Obviously, typical examples: stroke, heart attack, car crash, or devastating sports injury. And we've obviously had an example from our first speaker here. Something totally out of the blue, totally unexpected, and extremely traumatic. And this may well then lead to a sense of trust in the National Health Service in respect to that provision of care, and also hopefully with the preventive aspects as far as they can achieve them. But this is also, though, despite recognised failures, and I do understand the passion in which you spoke in terms, but I can't agree. I think of course there are scandals, as there are in all sorts of institutions, and we shouldn't have them. I think there is actually a healthy debate about the NHS. And in fact, there was a survey published just today from your former organisation. Maybe you're going to quote it, so I won't say any more. Read today's papers or whatever. So I want to finish in terms of, we talked about faith, but I also want to talk about trust. And last year, in November 2017, Ipsos published their latest Veracity Index, and they looked at the most and least trusted professions. And nurses came out top, 94%. Doctors very close behind, 91%. Least government ministers, 19%. Politicians generally, well, I know you've recently joined the House of Lords, and you only joined Parliament in 2017, and you've been a nurse for 40 years before that, so present company accepted. So in conclusion, back to my personal experience, I'm in my 7th decade. Now, on a slightly morbid note, possibly, I told you that I was conceived somewhere in the arena of the colleges. Might I collapse now and finish my life in the Cambridge area? Well, if I collapse now, and I've only got 1 minute, so it's not going to happen, I would have faith in your technology. You would pull out your mobiles and get onto 999. And I would also actually have faith in the local NHS services in Cambridge, that they would provide me with the emergency care I needed. And therefore, I ask you to oppose this proposition. Thank you.
Thank you, Dame Elizabeth, for that speech. And we'll now move over again to floor speeches. So would anybody like to make a point in proposition of the motion? We'll go on the front row there. Yeah.
Thanks. Andy Mackay. I'm a medical student at Hughes Hall. And I really am quite happy that we're having this debate today, because I think in terms of discussion on the NHS, we often don't get very far, and we had a very good point from the back there. And I really do think that people confuse the NHS with the principle on which it stands, which is free at the point of use healthcare. And you're quite right that there are many systems in the world which you have free at the point of use healthcare, but actually do better than the NHS on a lot of things. The NHS is very good on some things. It's very good for value. It's very good on access, but actually on health outcomes and some things, it's not very good. And we should be very careful, but we're always looking and we're always appraising our system to make sure we have the best healthcare. And I don't think we always do that. We had a good point also from Ava there about how the NHS isn't necessarily adapting to the future. And I think that, again, is where the idea of the NHS as a sacred cow actually comes as a block. We're an aging population. The kinds of things and reasons why people are getting ill are changing. You have a lot less acute conditions. You have a lot more long-term conditions, and we need to think about that. And you kind of were quite sad about the main parties not necessarily offering something. I'm really sad that Baroness Jolly didn't speak more about what the Lib Dems have done on this. There has been some fantastic expert and cross-party work. led by Norman Lamb, looking at ways in which we can fund the NHS into the future, integrate social care, integrate mental health. And we really, really, really need to be careful that we don't just say, well, the NHS is great, I had a great experience with the NHS, because we've all had that. We need to make sure we have an open debate, we need to make sure we keep appraising, because healthcare is going to be changing a lot and it's going to keep on changing. I really, really worry that the state of the debate in the country at the moment around the NHS means that it will fall behind, and we'll wake up one day and it won't be what we thought we were. But we still have the NHS, but is it really a free at the point of use health service if it's not properly funded, not properly set up, etc., etc.? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you for that speech. Would anybody like to make a point in opposition to the motion? That's no one that I can see. Okay, and finally, anybody in abstention? Yeah, there, get a microphone there.
I'm a first-year student at Girton College, also a medic, but still first year, so I don't know that much. But I think it's very important that, to recognize that the NHS is arguably one of the best systems in the world. But I think it shouldn't bask in this glory and compare itself to systems such as the US, for obvious reasons. I think that is detrimental to the NHS to glorify it, because if you speak to clinicians, they will tell you and point out many mistakes that the NHS has. I don't think that is healthy for any system to be glorified when there are many mistakes present. So I think that while the NHS is a very good system, it has its faults, and I don't think we should glorify it. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you for that, and we'll now move back to the main speeches then. And to close the case for the proposition, we have Sir Chris Ham, who was the Chief Executive of the King's Fund, an influential healthcare think tank from 2010 to 2018. Sir Chris.
Thank you. So I would like to bring some facts and some evidence into our discussion this evening, drawn from surveys carried out by Ipsos Mori, and also from some of the focus groups and deliberative activities we've undertaken at the King's Fund. And the first thing to say is, if you look at that evidence, there is undoubtedly very strong support in the country for the NHS and for its founding principles. We've heard a little bit about those principles: tax-funded, provided on the basis of need and not ability to pay, free at the point of use, universal and comprehensive. The principles that Nye Bevan believed in back in 1948 that still underpin the NHS and our strong support for it. One of the most striking pieces of survey evidence I keep on quoting comes from Ipsos Mori, when they go out from time to time, they ask a sample of the public, what makes you most proud to be British? And you get some fascinating responses to that question. Some people say John Lewis, some people say the BBC, a few people say the monarchy, but number one is the National Health Service. I think in 2012, near the London Olympics, Team GB came pretty close because of all those medals we won back at the London Olympics. But it's heartening, I find, as a believer in the NHS, that it comes out so well in those sorts of surveys. So that's some of the evidence. But of course, there is a narrative that we live in a consumerist society, that there are rising public expectations, and perhaps the NHS has not kept pace. We're falling behind in terms of our lived experience as patients, as service users, as citizens of the NHS by comparison with what we experience in other sectors. Now, there's some truth in that. I think we would all recognize that in some of the contacts we have with the NHS, it does feel rather clunky, rather old-fashioned, and quite frustrating. So while many of us actually love the NHS for what it does, and we've heard powerful arguments in favor of that, there are occasions when we hate it because it's not as responsive as we would like it to be. But here's some more facts, some more evidence. If you look at the surveys, a majority of us say When we do come into contact with the NHS, it either exceeds our expectations or it meets our expectations. About 3/4 of people who respond to surveys say that. Still leaves a quarter not in that category, but that's still very powerful. And the reasons why it doesn't meet our expectations are those you probably would expect. Long waiting times to get to see the GP or to get treated in hospital. Shortages of key staff like doctors and nurses and others. And sometimes the government of the day gets blamed because of lack of funding, which is perceived to be one of the major weaknesses too. On the focus group, the deliberative events side, the work we did at the King's Fund, what came out really, really powerfully and strongly is that as citizens, as patients, we are incredibly understanding of the NHS. We're incredibly forgiving. We understand the pressures that frontline staff work under, and we kind of accept that from time to time things will go wrong. We don't blame the staff. As I say, we blame the government. We blame the government for not funding the NHS to deliver the excellent world-class care we sometimes hear about. That's a generality, so let me make it a little bit more specific. 2 or 3 years ago, I came across this book by Michael Wise. It's called On the Toss of a Coin. Michael is a world-renowned dental surgeon. And he was diagnosed with sepsis, which is a very, very serious medical condition. And you can die, and he almost did die. If you read his book, it's a horror story at one level, but it's very reassuring at another level because he was treated in the NHS successfully, had very complex treatment in a major London teaching hospital in intensive care and a long period of rehabilitation, and he's now fully recovered to the point he's written his memoirs, and they're memoirs of praise for all the efforts in the NHS and the excellent care he received in this famous London teaching hospital. But just indulge me for a minute. I want to read from something else he wrote for a report we published at the King's Fund about one small aspect of his care during that period. He said, I want to give a simple personal example. I had a cannula inserted for the administration of intravenous antibiotics. I knew that it was not positioned into a vein, but the nurse would not listen. I then had repeated IV infusions of antibiotic, causing severe pain and swelling of my hand. It was only when I was seen later the next day by a consultant that the cannula was correctly placed. My trust in that nurse evaporated very rapidly. So, not a unique example, not a typical example either, and we've had that reflected in the contributions to the debate this evening. And yet, despite poor experiences, and it wasn't the only one, read his book. He's a great supporter of the NHS and concludes his care was excellent. It saved his life, it returned him to his family, and he is forgiving in the way that the deliberative events that we've conducted demonstrate is pretty typical of the population as a whole. And I want to echo some of the comments we've had from the floor this evening, if I may, because I believe, too, that we should be more demanding. We should be more critical. Things will always go wrong, but when we have appointments that are cancelled at short notice, often when we're waiting perhaps for a quite serious surgery or investigation in an NHS hospital, we shouldn't take that lying down, as it were. More importantly, when there are errors in our treatment, when that causes real harm for patients, we should take that up with the organisation providing that care to feed it back, because feedback should be valued and welcomed. None of us is perfect. We can always improve and do better. And acceptance of things going wrong delays the improvements in care, which I believe are possible even within the constraints we have of funding and the staff shortages that get in the way sometimes. So let me be clear what I'm saying. I believe the NHS is the right model. I want to endorse those who've argued that this evening. Those founding principles, tax-funded, free at the point of use, care based on need, not ability to pay. They've stood the test of time. There's no reason to change those principles. I've had the privilege in my career of traveling around the world and visiting other countries and seeing for myself other healthcare systems. We're not the best in the world. We're not the worst in the world. We're in the middle of the pack here, but there's no reason to change the basis of the NHS model. It works well for the amount of money our government chooses to put in, and it could do better. So let's be more demanding. Let's be more willing to complain in a constructive way. And we should also step up and play our own part as citizens and as patients, not as passive supplicants, but as active members of the NHS congregation. I believe strongly we have a shared responsibility with the NHS, with others, for our own health and well-being. The decisions we take every day contribute more to our health and well-being than most things the NHS can do for us. And likewise, when it comes to using health and care services, sharing in the responsibility that follows on, taking our drugs, following the prescribed treatment regime. Unless we do that, then highly skilled doctors and nurses, often under massive pressure, cannot help us. We can help ourselves. And finally, let's recognize the downsides of the NHS being seen as a national religion. And I want to be blunt here because my time has run out. Because the NHS is loved and valued, and it's the thing that makes us most proud to be British, it does get special treatment. We've come through a decade of austerity. There have been real cuts, damaging cuts in public services, but the NHS has been relatively protected. That means that social care remains chronically underfunded. It means that education services, public education services, are suffering. We've seen that in the news this week. Policing has been all over the news this week, and it has suffered too. And if I was being, perhaps, if I wanted to exaggerate to make the point, you could say that the NHS, because of its religious status, it confiscates resources that might have a bigger impact on our health and well-being if they were to go into social care, if they would go into education, if they go into policing. So yes, let's praise the NHS. Let's recognize what a jewel in our crown we have. But let's be honest too about its failings when things go wrong. And let's make sure that other public services get their share of the cake. Because if the goal is improved health in the population, we may need to put more into some of these other services to ensure we actually can deliver on that goal. I rest my case. Thank you.
Thank you, Sir Chris, for that speech. And now to close the debate as a whole, we have Eleanor Smith MP, who was previously was a nurse, but is currently the MP for Wolverhampton South West. The floor is yours.
Now, I am opposing the motion with this House regrets the status of the NHS as a national religion. But I'm also going to take on board what everybody else has said in regards to this. Now, I don't regret that the NHS is seen as a religion to the British people. That's because they feel so strongly about it. The NHS, to me, is the finest thing that has ever been created out of the ruins of the Second World War. A piece of pure socialism designed to remove the lack of money from the fear of illness. The welfare state was created to take the shame out of the need of the NHS, and it is at the core of its mission. To the people, it helps when they are seriously ill. It's a lifesaver. They believe in it. They even, not that we want to, perceive nurses as angels and surgeons and consultants as gods. I'm not saying that's right, but that's how people feel. It was Nigel Lawson, the Chancellor in Margaret Thatcher's administrator, and everybody has said this, who complained that the closest thing to the English people have to a religion. He was sneering at the NHS because it was due to its unique status that they couldn't privatise it. He described it as a religious, presumably as something whose values can't be proven, something to unquestioning superstition rather than tried and tested proof of worth for millions of patients. Even Margaret Thatcher had to say the NHS is safe in our hands when the cabinet papers were leaked showing that Adam Smith's institution proposed to force private health insurance on UK citizens came out. Now, I've worked for the NHS for 40 years. I did my last 12-hour shift as a theatre nurse in obstetrics and gynae a few days before I started my campaign to win the seat of Wolverhampton South West in 2017. They have always said that people who work in the NHS had a calling. It was like a religious vocation. So it's, for me, this is true, not only out of nursing staff. I've also found it to be true of many of the workers, the porters, the cleaners, the cooks, and everybody else who cares in the NHS. And people who work in the NHS are committed. When you meet another person that works in the NHS, you get that sense of sharing, that vision of a society that we all want. The NHS was created by Niall Bevan. He was of the generation who had seen real Victorian poverty, not a pretty sight. Bevan knew that poverty isn't a quaint, and its consequences were frightening and life-changing. In 1952, he wrote a book outlining his vision called In Place of Fear. In chapter 5, A Free Health Service, he writes, society becomes more wholesome, more serene, and spiritually healthier if it knows that its citizens have at the back of their consciousness the knowledge that not only themselves, but all their fellows have access, when ill, to the best that medical skills can provide. I worry now that 70 years after the founding of the welfare state, we are in a danger of forgetting what a world without the NHS was like. The workhouses. That people were forced into. What it was like to have no money to be able to pay for medical treatment. We are in danger of forgetting how precious the NHS is. The NHS helps the poor and the needy, as it says in the Bible and other religious books. It tells us that we should, because we're good health, that we shouldn't be the only for the rich. People put their faith in the NHS, and there's nothing wrong in that. Ever since 1947, the Tories have constantly called for the reform of the NHS. That would end its founding principle. The best known so-called reforms of our times now were the Lansbury reforms back in 2012. It was designed to break up and allow private companies in to run parts of it. I have seen how this has ate away at the core of the NHS without most people even knowing what was going on. It's coming home to roost now. Even the Tories themselves are questioning these shambolic changes. Now for my conclusion. As a Christian myself, I have no problems with the NHS being classed as a religion. I've worked in it, I had a sense of duty towards it, and one of the cornerstones of my life. It fits in with my philosophy of helping the poor and giving people their dignity when they are dying. You get that sense of fulfillment working for it because you're involved with the core experience of life. For years working in obstetrics theatres and gynae, I was present at the birth of children and experienced the sense of a new life beginning. This is my personal view because I worked in the NHS. My parents have used it. My children have used it. And now my oldest daughter is a postgrad nurse. She works in it. It gave me the sense of respect from society. No other job could give me that. And it changed my life and other people's life as well. for me as a young woman when I started to work, and 40 years later when I became an MP. I believe people voted for me above all because I was a nurse, and as it says, people trust nurses. People still have and do believe in the NHS. It's not perfect, but it's there. They have their faith, and they had their faith in me when they voted. I ask you to find again the faith that made the NHS such a powerful thing in 1948, and I ask you to vote against this motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Eleanor, for that speech, and thank you to all of the speakers in tonight's debate, and thank you also to all of the various stewards and committee members who've helped this event to run so smoothly. Just a couple of quick notices from me. The most important one is that tomorrow, being Friday, is our termly elections for Michaelmas term, so polls open at 8 o'clock in the morning. Online, look out for your emails and do vote tomorrow. The polls are open until 6. We've also got a panel on the refugee crisis tomorrow at 7 p.m. Now then, the only thing left to do is to vote, which we do here on our feet. The door on the left is marked noes, on the right marked ayes, and if you wish to abstain, please walk through the middle doors. We'll count up all the votes and announce the results in the bar shortly. Thank you.